So this is a guy called Cameron Munter, who I went to his office 2 days ago, and in his office were pictures and letters from nearly every president. And I was just awestruck. I couldn't believe it. Thank you, Cameron, for your service. And what made me even more awestruck was the humility. Cameron said, hey, I was in Afghanistan for a long time. I was in Pakistan. Any good Muslim will know you don't put pictures of yourselves or things of yourself in your office. So I had 30 years of service, diplomatic service, where I couldn't put a picture of anything up. So now that I'm CEO of EastWest Institute, he's got lots of really cool pictures, but I just thought that was a testament to the humility and the service of the man. So please, Cameron Munter.
Thank you. I hope I'm mic'd up and turned on. Thank you so much to Ethisphere. Thank you so much to Tim and all of you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this evening. And a shout out, of course, those of us in the Foreign Service know that one-year company, USAA, is the company that takes care of Foreign Service officers overseas. We always say, three assignments equals one fire. That is to say, basically, in a few assignments, everything you own is going to be gone. But thank God for USAA, at least you don't lose your shirt. I'd also like to thank AFLAC, a company that I've come to respect, a 10-year company. AFLAC back there, way to go. A lot of people I've worked with there have been also instrumental. But let me get to, since I'm sitting between you, I'm standing between you and your dinner. I will get to the point, the issues that we deal with at the EastWest Institute that come from I hope, the lessons that I've learned from a diplomatic career that I think tie us together this evening. These are things that I see when I read about Ethisphere, about character, about trust, about success. Those are Ethisphere words. And we at the EastWest Institute, where I'm now the CEO, it's a nonprofit, we have an idea about building trust, finding solutions. Those are our words. I think we're doing the same thing, and as I speak, I hope it becomes clear from my background why I think that's true. Let me tell you a little bit about EastWest Institute. We're an independent group. We have an international board and supporters. We're based on a small island off the coast of North America, Manhattan. And we are nonpartisan. We have offices in New York, Moscow, Brussels, Washington, D.C., and to put the West into East-West, we have San Francisco. We work in such areas as cyber crime, cyber issues, China, Russia, Middle East, South Asia. What we do is we anticipate problems, build relations, try to reshape debates. That is to say, we're not a think tank in the sense of someone who sits in a basement and writes policy books. We do what you do. We're out there with real people, trying to solve problems, trying to find common ground, trying to find ways in which we can solve issues that our children will not have to suffer from if we fail. My background, though, coming to this, was that I was a diplomat. I was a historian, actually. I was trained I think I was sitting at the table with people from Johns Hopkins, that excellent institution in Baltimore. I was trained as an historian until I realized that there was no future in the past. And the problem with that was I went to that welfare institution for overeducated, unemployable people called the U.S. Diplomatic Service. And in this, I realized that the definition of a diplomat is someone who will do everything for his country except live there. This was my calling. I didn't know it then, but I know it now, and I'll tell you more about that. Diplomacy is not foreign policy. Some would say American diplomacy stands for this, American diplomacy stands for that. Diplomacy, rather, is a craft. It's a craft of explaining, listening, coming to agreement, managing disagreement. It can't be done without long-term relationships. It can't be done without trust. Very often, people make the joke that comes out of years of the notion from an old British historian that said, a diplomat is sent overseas to lie for his country, something of this sort. Quite the opposite. The only thing you have when you're a diplomat is the ability to gain trust. You only can be trusted if you listen as much as you talk, if you learn how to respect people who are different from you, And good ethics, indeed good business, requires the same. So I pronounce you all diplomats, and I'll get back to that as well. Now, I joined the diplomatic service in the 1980s, and I worked for nearly 2 decades in Europe. I worked on the end of a dictatorship in Poland, in Germany, in what used to be called Czechoslovakia, erasing the line that Stalin drew over Europe, building institutions of stability, civic commitment, and trust, if you will, because that's what was lacking for those of you who remember, the gray-haired types in the audience like me who remember the old communist system. What was lacking was trust in those areas. And it wasn't easy after the fall of the Berlin Wall to build trust. It took time, it took patience, and it took understanding about different areas. And so I worked with a number of people in that time to try to build the new Europe, to try to figure out how we would work with partners who themselves were not business people. In Poland, for example, I worked with Boeing to sell Dreamliners to the Polish government. But the point is, Boeing brought more than that to the table. Boeing brought American business practices and American habits. In fact, I have to digress for a minute to tell you that when you're in the Foreign Service, you're allowed one good idea per career. And I had one good idea because I was the political officer in charge of assessing the the Czechoslovak breakup in 1993. You recall there was Czechoslovakia. They broke into 2 countries. I was assigned the task of reporting back to Washington why there was a Czechoslovak breakup. So I wrote what I thought was a pretty good cable. We called them cables in those days. And the cable said there are 3 zones in Central Europe. There is a beer zone, a wine zone, and a vodka zone. Right? The vodka zone is Poland. The wine zone is Slovakia and the Czech Republic. The beer zone is Bohemia. Czechoslovakia, that is Bohemia and Slovakia, cannot live in one zone, therefore the country must break up. In addition, the countries take on the characteristics of the drinks. Poles are like vodka, fiery and suicidal. Slovaks and Hungarians are like wine, duplicitous and smooth. And Czechs, they're like beer, boring and filling. Right? And I thought, this is a pretty good idea. My ambassador, of course, said to me, don't you dare send that back to Washington. You may notice, however, though, that in fact, this is the key to the politics of Central Europe, because these countries also have the characteristic of hating the country that drinks what they drink. The Poles don't really like the Russians. They both drink vodka. Slovaks hate Hungarians. They both drink wine. The Czechs and the Germans, well, they both drink beer. In other words, this was the key to understanding things. It, of course, didn't really enhance my career, but nonetheless, it was that insight. I say this only because those were happier days. Those were days in which I thought that we were going to have a diplomacy that was going to be involved with the happy notion of the reunification of Europe and the understanding of different cultures. After 9/11, roles changed. The challenge of counterterrorism was something that began to dominate American diplomacy. And when you're a diplomat, just like when you're working in a company, you deal with the world as it is, not often as you would like it to be. I didn't like the war in Iraq, but I volunteered to lead a provincial reconstruction team in the town of Mosul, that many of you have heard of recently, where there was going to be a hellacious battle very soon. I lived in Mosul in 2006, and I spent a lot of time drinking tea with people in Mosul, coming to appreciate in that community those people who sought to build a decent life, those people who, they were Iraqis, many of them had worked under Saddam Hussein in Saddam Hussein's system, but many of them were decent people. They were capable people. Maybe you think of that as a parallel to the kind of work you do. When you're ethical, do you deal with people because of their past, or do you deal with people because of what they believe? And do you deal with them because of their competence? Many of these people paid with their lives for the fact that they worked with us to try to build a decent future. Because when the Islamic State came in, many of my friends, with whom I'd corresponded for 10 years, suddenly disappeared. And I don't know where they are. So what I learned in that situation is, It's not all as much fun as it had been in Czechoslovakia, as it had been in Poland. There are serious issues we're dealing with. These are ethical issues, dealing with people who want to build a decent future, and there are risks involved. I also learned a little bit about America. I lived on a base when I was in Mosul, an American base, a FOB, a forward operating base. People who live on FOBs were called FOBits, right? This is the word we use for FOB. And among us FOBits, well, we thought when we were on the base we were safe. And one night, people came into the base and cut the throat of 3 people on my team. I had a team of 50 people, half military, half civilian. And the next day I called my team together and I said, you have to have a really notion of security here. You have to learn how to take care of yourself. My team said, we have it covered, boss. We all have weapons in our hooches. A hooch, where you live. What kind of weapon do you have? And I said, well, I don't have a weapon in my hooch. No, not the weapon they gave you when you came here, but the weapon you brought from home. And I said, I don't have a weapon at home. And they looked at me and they said, are you a Democrat? And I said, 3 things. I'm a Democrat. I voted for George McGovern, right? And I'm your commanding officer, right? But in all seriousness, what that told me as well, in addition to the hostility and the difficulties we had in Iraq, there are things we have to learn about the divisions in America as well. Because they said to me afterwards, what are you doing here? This isn't your war. This is not the war of people like you. Many people in our military, many people overseas who are working as contractors often don't feel they get the support from Americans who are not like them. And I can call myself a centrist, I can call myself, yes, a Democrat, but these are people from my country as well. So when I talk about understanding people who are different from you, let's not forget there are people in this country who are different from us. And understanding them is key too. Now, my reward for serving in Mosul was that I was assigned to be ambassador in Serbia. And in Serbia, I arrived just in time for Kosovo to declare independence. I don't know if you recall, if you watch CNN, but the response of the Serbian people, or some Serbian people, was to burn our embassy. And so I had my first experience with having the Marines who guard our embassy come to me and say, sir, you're the ambassador. Your job is to authorize the use of lethal force to protect this bit of America in Belgrade. And I signed the piece of paper. And I said, I authorize the use of lethal force. Now, as a diplomat, when you sign up to be a diplomat, that's not really what you want to see. And I'll commend the Marines that they had many times during that night, as our embassy burned, where they were authorized to defend themselves with firearms and instead talked the demonstrators into leaving. Talked them down. Literally, people had climbed in ropes over the walls and the Marines talked them out of fighting there. And it's to their credit that what was a very bad situation in Serbia didn't get worse. That the Marines were able to talk to the protesters and to prevent something that was bad from becoming worse. And during the time after that attack, I was able to work in Serbia with people just like the people who we worked with in Iraq, people who were decent, people who wanted a strong future, a good relationship with us, people who wanted to build, yes, with American businesses, they wanted to work in the future. And we were able to find people who were able to work with us and work with us in the right ways, ethically. And we didn't let the fact that we had been attacked and that our embassy had been burned get in the way of working with people who want the future. Well, my reward for that was I went to Baghdad. From there, I worked on the drawdown, the idea of getting the American troops out, or as our military people call it, the retrograde. And I had to work on relations between 2 tribes that spoke different languages, had different histories, different goals, profound historical differences. And I'm speaking of the Department of State and the Department of Defense. It was not easy, but we made it happen. Now, we made it happen. History will judge whether the withdrawal of American troops was a good idea. But again, in Baghdad, I found that there are people of goodwill, despite what you may read in the papers about fanatics, there are people of goodwill, people we can work with, and if you're patient enough to listen to them, you can find ways to come to agreement. What was my reward? I was sent to Pakistan. So in 2010, I became ambassador to Pakistan. We had a long-term problem and a short-term problem in Pakistan. The short-term problem was counterterrorism. The long-term problem was 200 million people with nuclear weapons who needed to be in a country that should be stable in its neighborhood, getting along with India, getting along with Afghanistan. And even though I was also introduced as someone who'd been in Afghanistan, I think it was faulty intel, I was only a visitor in Afghanistan. I didn't serve there. I worked under a man, very briefly, named Richard Holbrooke. And Richard Holbrooke, for those of you who knew him, was like the character in Amadeus who plays Mozart. He was an unbearable person who had a genius for understanding problems. When I worked for him, I dreaded the nightly phone calls. Holbrooke liked to call people at 3 in the morning to make sure that they were awake, right? And yet when Holbrooke died early, in late 2010, I missed him every day, because he was a man who was a visionary, someone who could see into other people, understand other people, figure out what they wanted, not necessarily what we did. We had problems in Pakistan. We had such problems as drone warfare. Now you talk about ethical issues. Those of you who are lawyers, you understand that the American policy on drones was one that people who study the laws of war, people who study Article 22, Article 10, Article 50 of the US Code, understand is problematic. I'm not a pacifist, and I actually believe that drones, if used correctly, can be humane weapons. But I also felt that they had to be done judiciously. I can't go deeper into this, because I'm sure that someone is going to take me in and question me if I do. It's a very tricky program. I just want to say that at this time, we were fighting wars where we were not only dealing with uncompromising opponents, jihadis, who were very uncompromising people, but we had difficulties with ourselves. What I like about the United States is that we were honest about it. We had internal fights. I had a lot of fights with my colleagues, but they were constructive, and that's the way we solve problems. We dealt with them, I think, openly and honestly. Now, I had a problem that a CIA contractor named Raymond Davis decided that he would, when he was held up in Lahore, that he would shoot the people who held him up. It took me a number of years, seemed like years, a number of weeks to get him out of jail. Relations with the Pakistanis deteriorated. We finally figured out how to get him out of jail, and my deputy, who is now the head of special operations down in Tampa, Mike Nagata, General Mike Nagata, said, "We got him out of jail, what else could possibly go wrong?" And what went wrong, of course, not wrong, but right, was that we had the Osama bin Laden raid. The Osama bin Laden raid was something that I actually got to watch on a screen on TV. Now, all of you have probably seen Zero Dark 30, or many of you have seen Zero Dark 30, the movie about that raid. And actually, the portrayal of the raid is very accurate. You remember the part where the American ambassador, played by George Clooney, comes in and saves the day, right? Right? You don't remember that part, do you? Because it's not in the movie, but I am promised that on the sequel that George Clooney will play the American ambassador. And it won't be, as it is in Homeland, that the American ambassador is a blonde woman. Although maybe this is something I need to get in touch with the inner me and find out whether that's, I don't know. In any case, what happened that night, just to give you the inside story, is we watched it very much as it took place in the movie. The Americans took an amazing amount of material from the compound in Abbottabad, and we were able to try to find links that helped us to break, in many ways, the Al-Qaeda network. But many people think, how could the Pakistanis not have known that this man was there? How could this man have been in a house that was a mile away from the Pakistani equivalent of West Point and not known that he was there? The problem is, and many articles have been written about this, about conspiracies. Perhaps many of you know Seymour Hersh, the journalist who's come up with a theory that basically the American government colluded with the Pakistani government and it was all, done in a different way. There's no evidence for that. There's no evidence that I ever saw, and I read all the fancy, classified information, that the Pakistanis knew that he was there. The problem is that, as Leon Panetta so elegantly said, you are either complicit or you're incompetent. And the Pakistanis were, sadly, incompetent. They didn't know that he was there. And it's something to understand when you have a public notion of a country and you say, Pakistan, these guys are bad guys. The Pakistani military and the Pakistani intelligence works in sleazy ways to undercut America. Now, I know that Pakistan has much to apologize for in its international actions. But let's be honest with ourselves. Let's say, if these people have the problem of incompetence, if their problem is not that they are strong, but they are weak, perhaps different approaches to dealing with Pakistan, to try to build a future where Pakistan is stable, where the decent people of Pakistan have a say in their government, where we can work with them. Maybe not vilifying them is the way to go. I would argue that many of you, in your businesses, those of you who work overseas, those of you who work domestically, understand that if you make your interlocutors into caricatures, you're making an enormous mistake. What is ethical about that is to try to see it from their point of view. You'll be accused of being a fellow traveler. You'll be accused of being soft on a country that maybe should be seen as one of America's enemies. I don't see it that way. And at the EastWest Institute, we don't see it that way. We talk to Japan, we talk to China, get that off the record. We talk to China, we talk to Russia, we talk to the Turkish government, we talk to the Iranian government, we talk to the Saudi Arabian government. We talk to people who have troubled human rights records, not because we support what they do. Just as when I talk to Pakistan, I talk to Pakistanis not because that was a measure of what my support was for them or our American support was, but because we need to understand them. That's the task that I think people need to have if they want to work with others in an area of respect. So the lessons learned from this that I draw is that after 30 years, I retired in 2012, and I came back to the EastWest Institute just last summer after teaching for a couple of years, that I feel more idealistic than I did when I began. Throughout my career, and especially in the latter part of my career, when I was dealing with an enormous amount of violence and hatred, what showed through to me is that in every country I was in, there's a basic decency to people. And if you blind yourself to that decency, you can make it much worse. So when you write your report, your performance evaluation at the State Department, usually what you say is, I got to Switzerland and our relations were here, and when I left Switzerland, our relations were there. I like to think that I wrote the first honest performance evaluation in Pakistan in 2012, where I said, I went to Pakistan and I took a route and I prevented it from being a catastrophe, right? And there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for understanding when things are really bad, how you can make them not get worse, how you can try to find underneath the surface, how there's still room for idealism. So once idealism, second, ethics and morality are necessary but not sufficient. You have to learn to accept that sometimes there are not good alternatives. There were many choices I had in Serbia, in Pakistan, in Iraq, where there was no good answer. But there must be an answer. And I think, as Tim mentioned, you have to own up to it. You have to trust not only others, but you have to trust yourself. You have to trust yourself that you're doing the best you can. And when you do, sometimes you may guess wrong. But you just have to try to do that. And I'm not a religious man. I'm essentially a lapsed Protestant. But I do think there's wisdom when you think of the book of Romans and you think of the phrase, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces patience, and patience produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. That's what I think you stand for. What I think you, in your efforts to be in this organization, stand for is the hope that by being realistic, not by having a fantasy, but by being realistic, you're bringing hope to people that there is a way to act in a future that's based on more than just tough business, tough politics, or the easy answer. This, I think, is the hope that binds us, the EastWest Institute, and those of you in EastWest here. We build trust at EastWest Institute. We find solutions, and we have hope based not on fantasy, but on experience. I often talked to Pakistanis about their relationship with India, and they said, we can never be friends with India. And I said, have you ever heard of the history of the way that Germany and Poland have gotten along? I've lived in Poland. I've lived in Germany. I speak Polish. I speak German. I've been among these people. I've read their poetry. I've drunk their beer and their wine and their vodka, right? It's one of the benefits of being a diplomat. But the fact is, Germans and Poles, for all their problems, they get along. It's possible. It is possible for you to solve problems. And it may be a while before India and Pakistan solve their problems, but it can be done. And we've seen it. We're basing it on reality. You are people who work in business. You don't make it in business unless you base your judgments on reality. And you're doing it in a way that gives hope. And that's where I think Ethisphere and EastWest Institute are working in the same world. I think of those people who have supported us in the past. We have had support from Dell. We've had support from Pepsi. We've had support from Microsoft and many others. We have partners like you. We need your help. We at EastWest Institute need your help to prevent cyber threats, to bring world leaders to the table to talk about peace, to anticipate tomorrow's problems before they get here, and to shape the debate on how to solve them. And back there at table 49 is my buddy Chris. And if any of you want to get more information about the EastWest Institute before you leave tonight, please stop by with him, and he's happy to fill you in. Because we'd love to work with you. We'd love your support, and we'd love to see how you, since I called you all diplomats, and I see us as diplomats as well, how you can work with us. So once again, thank you for this opportunity. It's an honor to speak to you. I know, believe me, I know what you do. I've seen what you do overseas. I know what you do here domestically, even though I'm a bit of a stranger to that area outside this island off the coast of North America. So thank you so much for this honor. Thank you for being a partner in the future. Thank you for bringing hope.